Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for your flexibility. Great turnout. Two logistical details first. Regarding the warmth of the room that we just came from, the organizing team has informed the Postilion about that, and that will be changed for future sessions. And the other thing is that we are taking questions for this session in Swapcard. So you can already get the app ready if you wish to do so, and you can use the question function there. And then as you're reading other people's questions, you can like them if you would especially appreciate those being asked. Then they will get priority. We may go a little bit over time in this session because of switching rooms. You are welcome to leave when you wish. The portion that will go over time is, of course, the questions at the end. So, everybody please give a big applause for Gideon's presentation about going beyond simple existential risk.
Existential risk studies is the interdisciplinary science of studying existential and global catastrophic risk. So what is the object of our study? There are many definitions of existential risk, including an irrecoverable loss of humanity's potential or a major loss of the expected value of the future. Both of these from essentially a transhumanist perspective. In this talk, however, I'll be using existential risk in the broadest possible sense, taking my definition from Beard et al. 2020, with existential risk being risk that may result in the very worst catastrophes, encompassing human extinction, civilization collapse, and any major catastrophe commonly associated with these things. X risk is a risk, not an event. It is defined, therefore, by potentiality, and thus is inherently uncertain. We can clearly distinguish between different global and existential catastrophes, nuclear winters, pandemics, etc., and drivers of existential risk. And there are no clear one-to-one mapping of these. The IPCC, commonly and helpfully, splits drivers of risk into hazards, vulnerabilities, exposures, and responses. And through this lens, it's clear that risk isn't something exogenous to the system we're in, but is reliant on decision-making and governance failures, even if that failure is merely a failure of response. The thesis I present here is not original and draws on the work of a variety of thinkers, although I accept full blame for things that may be wrong. I will argue that there are two different paradigms for studying X-risk: a simple paradigm and a complex paradigm. I would argue that EA unfairly neglects the complex paradigm, and that this is dangerous if we want to have a complete understanding of X-risk to be able to combat it. I'm not suggesting that the simple paradigm is wrong, but that alone it currently doesn't and never truly can capture the full picture of X-risk. I think the differences in the two paradigms of existential risk are very diverse, with some being intellectual, due to fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of the world we live in, and some are cultural, which is more contingent on which thinkers' works gain prominence. I won't really try too hard to distinguish between cultural and intellectual differences, as I think that would just make everything a little bit too complicated in this presentation. The presentation is merely a start, a challenge to the status quo, not asking for it to be torn down, but asking for more epistemic and methodological pluralism. This call for pluralism is the core of my argument. The simple paradigm of existential risk is at present dominant in EA circles. It tends to assume that the best way to combat X-risk is to identify the most important hazards, which is often conflated with risk, find out the most tractable and neglected solutions to those, and then work on that. It often takes a relatively narrow range of epistemic tools: forecasting and toy models, such as game theoretic approaches, thought experiments, or well-thought-out kill mechanism causal chains, as fundamentally useful tools at examining the future which is taken to be, at its core, understandable and, to a degree, predictable, if only we were rational enough and had enough information. It's a methodology that, given the relative lack of evidence on X risk, is far more based on rationality than empiricism. A methodology that emerges more from analytic philosophy than empirical science. Thus, risks are treated quasi-independently. So the question, what is the biggest X risk, makes sense, and we can approach X risk by focusing on quasi-discrete cause areas, such as AGI, engineered pandemics, or nuclear warfare. Such an approach can be seen in published works by the community, and in the assumption of the programmes and more are set up in. The precipice finds the separation of X risk into the somewhat arbitrary categories of natural, anthropogenic, and future risk to be useful, and quantifies those risks based on what each of those quasi-independent hazards contributes. The Cambridge Existential Risk Initiative Summer Research Fellowship, which I was lucky to participate in over the summer, separated their fellows into categories based broadly on separate, discrete risks: AI, climate change, biosecurity, nuclear weapons, and the one thing I couldn't fit onto the slides, mist and meta for everything else. Once again, this promotes a siloed approach that sees these things as essentially independent, or at least treating them independently is the best way to understand them and make progress on them. Even for the swap card for this conference, there's no category for areas of interest for existential risk, vulnerabilities, systemic risk, cascading risk. While there are two categories for AI, a category for nuclear security, a category for climate change, a category for biosecurity. The simple approach to existential risk permeates almost all discussions we have in EA about X risk. It is the sea in which we swim in. Thus, it profoundly affects the way that we as EA think about X risk. I think it could accurately be described as, in the sense that Kuhn discussed it, as a paradigm. That's the simple approach. A world which at its core we can understand. A world where the pathways to extinction are to some degree definable, identifiable, and quantifiable. Or at least, if we are rational enough, we can understand what the most important X risks are, prioritise those, and deal with these. It's no wonder that this paradigm has been attractive to us effective altruists. This stuff is our bread and butter. The idea that we can use rational methodologies in good doing is what we were founded on, and retains its power and strength through the ITN framework. The problem is, I'm not sure this is very good at capturing the whole picture of X risk. And we ignore this whole picture at our peril. Because maybe the world isn't so simple, and the future not so predictable. Every facet of our society is increasingly interconnected. Our ecological climatic system coupling to our socio-economic system. Global supply chains tied to our financial system, tied to our food system. A future emerging from such complexity will be far from simple, or obvious, or predictable. Risk that threatens humanity in such a world will likely interact in emergent ways, or emerge in ways that are not predictable by simple analysis. Rather than predictable kill mechanisms, we might worry about tipping thresholds beyond which unsafe system transitions may occur, compounding snowballing effects, worsening cascades, spread mechanisms of collapse and risk, and where, in a complex interconnected system, we as actors can have the most leverage. Arguably, we can only get the whole picture by acknowledging irreducible complexity, and that the tools we currently use to give us well-defined credences and a sense of understanding and predictability in the future are woefully insufficient. We can't predict the future or understand the world from first principles. I think it's important to note that my argument here is not there is complexity, therefore risk, but rather that the sort of global, interconnected and interdependent systems that we have in place makes the sort of risk we are likely to face inherently unpredictable. And so it isn't so easily definable as the simple paradigm likes to make out. Even Ord acknowledges this unpredictability, putting the probability of unforeseen anthropogenic risk at 1 in 30. In fact, whilst I have and will continue to attack the core of Ord's approach in this talk, I think he acknowledges many of the issues that I raise here anyway. And it's not like this approach, focusing on slightly fuzzy mechanisms emerging out of feedback loops, thresholds and tipping points, is wholly foreign to EA. It's arguable that the risk from AGI is motivated by this exact same thing, by the existence of a tipping point, which when we pass, may lead to magnifying impacts in a positive feedback loop, the intelligence explosion, which will lead to unknown, but probably very, very dangerous effects that, due to the complexity of all the systems that are involved, we probably can't predict. This is rarely dismissed as pure hand-waviness, as we acknowledge we are dealing with a system that our reasoning cannot fully comprehend. Whilst EAs tend to utilise a view of the concepts of the complex approach with AGI, elsewhere it's ignored, which is slightly strange, but more on this later. It's arguable that the complex paradigms focusing on the complexity of the world is somewhat axiomatic, based on a different set of assumptions about the way the world functions to the simple approach. One that sees the world as a complex network of interconnected nodes and risk as primarily emerging from the relatively well-known fragility and vulnerability of such a system. I don't actually think I can fully prove this to you, because I think it's a fundamental worldview shift, not just a change of facts, but in the way that you understand the world. It's almost like the two approaches have taken fundamentally different assumptions. And, as in the words of Carl Sagan, this is not something that is suitable for experimental verification, at least not more than once. However, if you do want to be convinced, or at least understand a little bit more of the sort of conceptual framework applied to risk, I'd look at a lot of the literature on complexity and the literature on risk, on the coupled socio-technical ecological political system, the literature on risk like the IPCC, texts like the Risk Society, on how we conceptualize risk. I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, and I do actually have a reading list at the end, but right now, I just hope you're willing to come along for the ride, even if you don't fully buy this premise. This is actually why I'm treating this as an entirely different paradigm to the current EA paradigm. The complexity approach is fundamentally different. It sees the world as inherently complex, and whilst facets of it are understandable by mere human reasoning, at its core, the system is so chaotic that we can never fully, or even nearly fully, grasp it. It sees the future as not just unpredictable, but inherently undefined. It sees risk mostly emerging from our growing, fragile, interconnected system, and typically sees existential hazards as only one part of the equation, with vulnerabilities, exposures, and responses perhaps at least as important. It takes seriously our uncertainty, our massive uncertainty, with regards to what the topography of the epistemic landscape around X-risk is. And so it says that uncertainty should be baked into any understanding or approach. And thus, it favours foresight methods rather than forecasting. The epistemic tools that serve the simple approach are simply not useful at dealing with the complexity that this paradigm takes as central to X-risk. And thus, new epistemic tools need to be developed, and frameworks need to be developed. Whether these have successfully been developed or not is debatable. A defender of the simple paradigm might argue that this characterization is unfair. After all, thinkers like Ord discuss direct and indirect risk. This is helpful. The problem is, it's very unclear what constitutes a direct versus indirect existential risk. If a nuclear war kills almost everyone, but the last person alive trips off a rock and falls off a cliff, what was the direct existential risk? The nuclear war or the rock? Well, this example could rightfully be considered to be absurd. After all, if one person is alive, humanity will go extinct after that person dies. But I hope the idea still broadly stands. Very few direct existential risks actually wipe the last person out. What about and also, it's a little bit more complicated than this anyway. What about an exceptionally deadly pandemic that could only spread due to the global system of international trade? And that the response of reducing transport combined with climate change causes major famines across the world, cascading more. Where only because both the famine and the pandemic is extinction occurs. Which one of those two is the direct risk? Suddenly, the risk stops looking so neat and simple and separate, but still it is just, if not more so, as worrying. The logic of direct versus indirect risk doesn't work because it still favours a quasi-linear mechanistic worldview. Often, something is only considered a risk factor if it leads to something that is a direct risk. So, such arguments can be seen in John Halstead's enormous climate Google Doc, which I think is a relatively good canonical example of the simple approach. Here, he argues climate change is not a large contributor to existential risk because it can't pose a direct risk and isn't a major contributor to things which then themselves wipe us out. So it's not a direct risk, nor a first-order indirect risk, so it's not a major risk. Obviously, this is somewhat simplifying. It's a very long 400-page document. In fact, because the simplicity of merely needing to identify the answer to whether climate is a direct risk or a first-order indirect risk, there is no need for a methodology in the 400 pages of the report, or the slippery word theory. One can merely answer the question by sitting and thinking about it and making a best guess. The type of system and causal chain dealt with in the simple approach is within the realm that one person can make such a judgment. But if you acknowledge the complexity of the global network, such reliance on individual reasoning appears like dangerous overconfidence. You might then say that the simple approach can still deal with issues by then looking at second-order indirect risk, third-order, fourth-order, and so on. But what happens when you get to nth-order indirect risk? This mechanistic, predictable worldview can't deal with that degree of complexity. A reply to this may just be that direct risks are just so much larger in expectation. However, this actually doesn't fit with our understanding of from the study of complex and adaptive networks, and work done by scholars like Loramani on volcanoes further show that cascading, nth-order impact of volcanic eruptions may be far larger than the primary direct effects. Even take the ship stuck in the Suez Canal. The ripple effects seem far larger than the initial direct effects of that ship getting stuck. I think this may well turn out to be the same for the long-term impact of COVID-19 as well. Thus, it seems the simple approach struggles when dealing with the ways which most risk tends to manifest in the real, complex, interconnected world which we live in, through vulnerabilities and exposures, through systemic risk and through cascades. In fact, the simple approach tends to take existential risk as synonymous with existential hazard, relegating other contributors to risk, like vulnerabilities, exposures and responses, to the background. It has no real theory of systemic risk or cascading risk. And when I mentioned cascading risk to John Halstead in the context of his climate report, he said he simply didn't think it worth investigating. I don't think this is a problem with John. Despite our disagreements, he is an intelligent and meticulous scholar who puts a tremendous amount of effort into that report. I think this is a problem of simple existential risk analysis. It is not capable of handling the complexity of the real world. So, we need complex risk analysis that acknowledges the deep, interconnected emergence and complexity of the world we're in, to truly analyse risk. But here we're faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, we have the recognition of irreducible complexity of the world and inherent uncertainty of the future. On the other, we need to act within this system to understand the risks and combat them. So the question is how? The first step towards more complex risk analysis picks up the baton from the simple approach in emphasising compounding risk, how different hazards, as well as other components of risk, interact. The two approaches deal with this compounding somewhat differently, and more of this will be discussed a little bit later. Secondly, risk then becomes expanded beyond the concept of existential hazards, which is what the simple paradigm focuses on, to discuss vulnerabilities and exposures as well as responses. To explain vulnerabilities and exposures, imagine someone with a peanut allergy. The peanut is the hazard. The allergy, the vulnerability. And the exposure is being in the same room as the peanut. The hazard is what kills you. The vulnerability is how you die. And the exposure is the interface between the two. So we can expand what we should do to combat existential risk from just putting out fires, which is essentially what the hazard-centric approach focuses on, to a more systemic approach focusing on making our overall system more resilient to existential risk. We can identify key nodes where systemic failure could occur and try and increase their resilience, such as the work that Laura Marnie has been doing on identifying global pinch points where small magnitude volcanic eruptions may cause cascading impacts resulting in a global catastrophe. In doing this, we are abandoning the nice, neat categories that the simple approach creates. In many ways, it no longer makes sense to talk about risks, as though these were independent fires that we just need to put out. Rather, it makes sense to speak about contributors to overall risk, with attempts made to shift the system towards greater security by identifying and reducing all sources of risk that could be reduced. This doesn't just include hazard, but other contributors as well. Not just acknowledging the initial effect, but everything that makes each cascade more likely. These cascades are not predictable, and the threshold beyond which the feedback loop occurs not inherently knowable, and thus foresight, where we may get a sample of what could occur, rather than forecasting, where we predict what will occur, will be far more useful. This simple linguistic shift from risks to risk can be surprisingly powerful at highlighting the different approaches and assumptions of the simple and complex paradigm. Acknowledging that we don't actually know the pathways to extinction actually opens up new approaches to combating risk. We may see reducing vulnerability as more impactful than under the simple approach. See reducing the probability of feedbacks and of passing thresholds beyond which we may reasonably assume catastrophe may follow as an appropriate course of action. Or even if we're unsure about what exactly will kill us, what hazard will kill us, we might want to focus on what is driving risk in general, rather than this downstream approach to specific hazards, be it work on agents of doom or Bostrom's vulnerable world emerging out of the semi-anarchic default condition. Whilst the complex approach acknowledges the difficulties that the non-linearities and complexities bring, in other ways, it allows for a broader repertoire of responses to risk as well. Cotton Barrett et al.'s work on defence in depth also shows this, for example. Another approach to complexity might be what we call the play it safe or planetary boundaries approach. Here, we identify thresholds whereby we know the system is safe and try to avoid crossing into the unknown. It's like we're on the edge of a dark forest. It may be safe to walk in, but better safe than sorry. It applies a precautionary principle that in such a complex and dangerous system, we should have the epistemic humility to simply say, better the devil you know. This approach has rightfully been critiqued by many who tend to favour a more simple approach. It's very hand-wavy, with no clear mechanism at all to extinction or even collapse, with the boundaries chosen somewhat arbitrarily. Nevertheless, it may be argued that lines had to be drawn somewhere. And wherever they would be drawn would be arbitrary. And so, this is a play it safe approach, because we don't know what is beyond these points, rather than a avoid knowable and quantifiable catastrophe approach. However, such an approach is still very problematic, even in that acknowledgement, and is particularly problematic if we want to prioritise, something I will briefly discuss later. Something similar to this approach could be seen as a solution to Bostrom's vulnerable world and Mannheim's fragile world. If increasing technological development and complexity puts us in danger, then maybe we should take every effort to stop this. After all, these things are not inevitable. Of course, Bostrom himself would never accept this. To him, this stagnation alone poses an X risk, and instead he proposes a global surveillance state. But that's slightly beside the point. However, we are still faced with a number of problems. We are constantly moving into unprecedented territory, and sometimes we are left with no option that is nice and without fundamental and hard trade-offs. McCaskill, in What We Owe the Future, somewhat successfully argues that technological stagnation would leave us at danger of many threats. Sometimes we have already gone into the forest. We can hear howling all around, and we have no idea what's going on. And we are genuinely posed with a choice of things to do. But no option can be played safe. We are stuck between a rock and a hard place under such deep uncertainty. And if we are, how can we act if we refuse to reduce the complexity of the world? We can't just play it safe, because every option fails a precautionary principle. What do we do in such cases? This is the exact dilemma that faces me in my research. I'm researching the interaction of solar radiation modification, also known as solar geoengineering, and accidental risk, both how SRM increases and decreases risk. As it is therefore simultaneously combating the source of some risk and itself increasing risk in other ways, the sort of play-it-safe approach to complexity just doesn't work. Although before I properly explain this, and how maybe I can start to unpick this, I ought to explain exactly what I'm on about. Solar radiation modification, SRM, otherwise known as solar geoengineering, is a set of technologies that aim to reduce a small amount of sunlight to reduce warming. Sunlight enters the Earth. When sunlight enters the Earth, sun is reflected. That which isn't reflected is absorbed by the Earth, which is then re-emitted as long-wave infrared radiation. Some of this infrared radiation escapes to space, and some gets absorbed by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, warming it. As we increase greenhouse gas concentrations, we increase the warming. SRM tries to reduce this warming by decreasing the amount of light entering the Earth, by reflecting it back to space, by either injecting aerosols into the stratosphere, mimicking the natural effect of volcanoes, or by brightening clouds, or a related technique that isn't quite the same thing, but involves thinning other clouds. This would likely reduce temperatures globally, and the climate probably, according to climate models, would be generally close to pre-industrial. But this is not a sort of linear offset or any sort of reversal of the same thing that's happened. And it comes with its own risk that may make it far more dangerous than not having done it in the first place. Those working on the simple paradigm have tended to reject the contribution to existential risk from climate change as very large. Toby Ord estimates the risk at 0.1% probability of extinction. Will McCaskill, in What We Owe the Future, suggests it's hard to see how even 7 to 10 degrees of warming could cause collapse. Both of these approaches have tended to use proxies for what causes extinction or collapse, trying their best to come up with simple, linear, causal models. Toby Ord wants to look at whether heat stress will cause the world to become uninhabitable, and Will wants to look at whether global agriculture will entirely collapse, killing everyone. These simple proxies, whilst making it easier to reason in simple causal chains, are just not demonstrative of how risk actually manifests in the real world. Some have then attempted to argue whether climate change poses a first order, second order indirect existential risk, which is mostly John Halstead's approach in his climate report. But once again, I think this misses the key point. Through a complex paradigm, I think climate change becomes something we should take much more seriously as a contributor to existential and global catastrophic risk. Because not only does climate change make hazards more likely and stunt and reduce our ability to respond, but also, and perhaps most keenly, it makes us more vulnerable and may act to majorly compound risk and make cascades more likely in a way that makes catastrophe far more probable. A variety of the scenarios where a one hazard to kill us all approach doesn't work was explored in the recent Climate Endgame paper, Kemp et al. 2022. One area where the paper strongly disagrees with the status quo in EA is via systemic risk. In the precipice, Ord argues that a single risk is more likely than two or more occurring in unison, so we should be more worried about those single risks to kill us all. However, Climate Endgame explores how climate change has the ability to trigger widespread, synchronous, systemic failure via multiple indirect stresses. Food system failures, economic damage, water insecurity, natural disaster, the hazard themselves becoming more likely. Coalescing and reinforcing until you get a system-wide failure. A similar, but slightly different risk is that of a cascade, with vulnerabilities increasing until one failure sets off another and another and another, and the whole system snowballs. In the case of climate, this cascade may not just refer to our socio-economic system, but there's evidence that tipping cascade in the physical climatic system show there is a non-negligible chance of major, near-synchronous collapse of major elements in the Earth system at some point in the future. It's not that this is necessarily probable, but it's certainly plausible. Such spread of risk is very well documented in the risk literature, as occurred, for instance, in the 2008 financial crisis, but has almost entirely been neglected by the simple paradigm of existential risk. The ability of such reinforcing systemic risk to occur from initial hazard that would be far smaller than the simple paradigm would ever consider catastrophic should really worry us. Normally, lower magnitude hazards are more common, and we are likely severely neglecting the consequences of those. If one takes systemic failures seriously, climate change suddenly looks a lot more dangerous than the simple approach lets it be. So, a technology like SRM that reduces climate damage may seriously reduce the risk of catastrophe. There is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that SRM moderates climate impact at relatively medium levels of warming. However, one thing that has hardly been explored is the capacity of SRM to combat hitting those Earth system tipping thresholds, which, whilst not essential to have as climate as being a major contributor to our existential systemic risk, is certainly one key contributor. So, alongside some colleagues, at the moment at Utrecht and Exeter, we're starting to investigate the literature, maybe using some models, and try an expert elicitation to try and make an understanding of how SRM impacts these tipping thresholds. So, this is one way we can deal with complexity. Try and make a start with things that we know contribute to systemic risk in cascades in ways that could plausibly be catastrophic, and observe whether these can be reduced. However, SRM also acts as potentially a major contributor to risk. In one sense, this contributor to risk is easier to understand from the simple paradigm, as SRM may act as a direct contributor to great power conflict, which is in itself often considered a first-order indirect risk. So, here, perhaps the simple and complex paradigm agree. This contribution to great power conflict has been explored in many people's work. Some, just simple two-variable analyses, and of compounding as well, simple analyses of the interaction of SRM and volcanic hazards, while some try and use much greater complexity to highlight how SRM may change geopolitics and tensions in a way which may change how other risk spreads and compounds. One key way that SRM may impact this is by coupling our global geopolitical, socio-political system with the global ecological climatic system, allowing for risks to spread from our human system to the climatic system that supports us and our society much far faster than before. This might really worry us, given how our climatic system then feeds back into our human system, and so on, in a positive feedback loop. The second manner which SRM contributes to risk is by the so-called latent risk, a risk that lays dormant until it's activated by the triggering of another catastrophe often. Here, if you stop carrying out SRM, you get rapid warming, which is often called termination shock. And faster rates of warming, much faster than we would have got if we'd never done SRM in the first place. This will likely raise risk through all the pathways discussed for climate change itself. However, to add another wrinkle into this, such termination shock is most plausible because of another global catastrophe. So what would occur is what Seth Bound calls a double catastrophe. Again, highlighting how synchronous failure might sometimes be more likely than single failure. However, in investigating this, to get a better understanding of the physical effects and plausibility of such direct double catastrophe under different conditions, I've been exploring how SRM would interact with another catastrophe that had climatic effects, namely a catastrophe involving the injection of soot into the stratosphere after a nuclear exchange. Here, it's actually very unclear if the termination shock and other effects of SRM actually make the impact of such a nuclear exchange worse. And it's likely that actually SRM may act to slightly moderate the effects. We're still very, very, very uncertain, and uncertainties in all the models, and this has been using very simple back-of-the-envelope calculations and plausible physical pathways, not the sort of modelling we'd want for this to be rigorous. I think, though, that this does show that we cannot simply go interacting hazards and complex risk. Oh, definitely this makes things worse. Because sometimes it doesn't. But I also think it shows that the neglect of such complex risk by the simple approach loses a hell of a lot of the picture of what's actually contributing to existential risk. The other thing I'm trying to explore is the plausible cascades and spread mechanisms of risk which SRM encourages, or may dampen. In part, I'm doing this through foresight exercise like PAR-EVO, participatory evolution, where experts and others are brought together to generate collaborative and creative storylines of diverging futures. Unlike forecasting, such scenarios don't have probabilities put on them. In fact, due to the specificity needed for a good scenario, a good scenario should have a probability of 0, like a point on a larger probability distribution. But hopefully, a scenario can give us a little bit of a map of what might potentially occur given the drivers that are in place. So, we highlight a whole load of plausible scenarios, acknowledging that none of these themselves, like that, are likely to come to fruition, but hopefully on the premise that these should perhaps highlight some of the key areas in which good and useful action should follow. For example, my scenarios will be focusing on different SRM governance schemes in response to different catastrophic shocks, so hopefully highlighting some common failures of governance systems to more heavy-tailed shocks. Scenarios are also useful, in many other areas of studying X-risk, such as the use of more tabletop game-like scenarios, like intelligence rising, to highlight the interactions and the development of transformative artificial intelligence and international tensions in politics and geopolitics. Nevertheless, ultimately, what is needed is to do a risk analysis, comparing the ways in which SRM reduces and contributes to risk, and what leverage could be used to reduce each of these contributors. This approach, doing the risk analysis, is a way off yet, and I'm unsure if we have necessarily good methodologies for doing this. Nonetheless, by acknowledging the large complexities and utilising methods to uncover how SRM can contribute to risk and reduce risk in the global interconnected system, we get a far better picture of the risk landscape than under the simple approach. Many who take the simple approach have been quite happy to reject SRM as a risky technology without major benefits in mitigating X risk, and have been happy to do a quick and dirty risk-risk analysis based on their very simple models of how risk may propagate. As we explore the more complex feedbacks, interactions, and cascades of risk, the validity of such simple analyses is, I think, brought into question, highlighting the need for the complex paradigm in this field. Finally, it's important to note that it's not obvious how any given upstream action, like research, for example, contributes to risk. Even doing research, it helps rearrange the risk landscape in unpredictable ways. And so even answering whether research makes deployment of the technology more likely is hard, as research spurs governance, impacts tensions, impacts our ability to uncover different technologies, and makes the system more resilient, less resilient, etc. Once again, the complex web of impacts of research also needs to be untangled. This is tricky and needs to be done very carefully. But given that EA dominates the X-risk space, it's not something I think we can shirk doing. I also think it's important to note that these approaches, whilst often from different intellectual assumptions, and I'm really talking about in general, not just in my example of SRM, have their differences manifest predominantly, perhaps, culturally, rather than intellectually. In many ways, the two approaches converge. This is perhaps surprising, and maybe act as a caution and a criticism of my grandstanding of fundamental axiomatic differences. For example, the worry about the intelligence explosion is at its core, I think, a worry about a threshold, beyond which we move into dangerous unknowns with systems smarter that may kill us. In many ways, it should be more comfortable inside the complex paradigm without well thought out kill mechanisms, with a little bit of hand waviness, acknowledging irreducible uncertainty and undetermination of the future, and how powerful technologies, phenomena, and structures and incentives within our complex global integrated system are likely to contribute huge to risk. And AGI risk seems much more at home in that paradigm than it necessarily does in the simple paradigm. Similarly, work that thinkers like Luke Kemp, who ostensibly aligns more with the complex paradigm, have done on agents of doom, which tries to identify the key actors that are drivers of hazards, probably fits more neatly in the simple paradigm than it does in the complex paradigm on that work. And I think it probably implies that a whole lot of us from across the spectrum are just missing potentially important contributions to existential risk, irrespective of our paradigm. As a close to this talk, and I promise you I'm nearly done, I would like to briefly summarise Adrian Curry's arguments in his wonderful paper, Existential Risk, Creativity and Well-Adapted Science. This is relevant perhaps a level above what I'm talking about in this talk, arguing what meta-paradigm we should take. He suggests that all research has a topographical landscape with peaks representing important findings. Thus, research is a trade-off between exploring this landscape and exploiting it. I think that the simple approach is pretty good at exploiting certain peaks, but is very bad at understanding the topography of the whole landscape, which I tend to think the complexity approach is generally much better at. But, as Curry convincingly argues in his paper, even the complexity paradigm alone probably isn't sufficient. X-risk studies is in a relatively novel epistemic situation. The risks we deal with are unique. In the words of Carl Sagan, not susceptible to experimental verification, at least not more than once. The systems are wild, and thus don't favour systemic understanding. We're not just uncertain as to the answers to key questions, but also really uncertain as to what questions to ask. We're in a crisis field, centred around a goal rather than a discipline. In fact, we're completely uncertain what disciplines actually matter the most. All of this leaves us in an epistemic situation, where in many ways uncertainty, and thus creativity, should be at the core of our approach. both trying to get an understanding of the topography of the landscape and because it stops us getting siloed. On the spectrum of exploring versus exploiting, exploratory approaches should be favoured, because we should reasonably see ourselves as deeply uncertain about nearly everything in X-Risk. Even if people haven't managed to change our minds on a contributor to risk, experience should tell us that we are likely wrong in ways that no one yet understands. And there is probably quite a lot of even bigger peaks out there which we just can't see. We should be methodological omnivores, happy to use many methodologies and tailoring these methodologies to our local contexts, and with a pluralistic approach to techniques and evidence rather than a siloed one, increasing the epistemic tools at our disposal. Both of these imply the need for much more pluralism than at present, rather than the hegemony of any one approach. I am very worried that EA's culture, power structures, and financial resources are pushing us away from creativity and towards conservatism and hegemony in the X-Risk space. In conclusion, this talk hasn't shown you that the simple approach is wrong, just that it provides a thoroughly incomplete picture of the world that is insufficient at dealing alone with the complexity of many drivers of existential risk. This is why I, and many others, call for greater methodological diversity and pluralism, including a concerted effort to come up with better approaches to complex and systemic risk. The simple approach is clearly problematic, but it is far easier to make progress on problems using it. It's like the Newtonian physics of existential risk studies. But to get a more complete picture of the field, we need a more complex approach. Anders Sandberg put this nicely in a conversation I had with him, seeing the risk network as having a deeply interconnected core where the approach of irreducible complexity dominates, a periphery with less connections where a more simpler compounding risk approach can dominate, and a far-off periphery where the simple hazard-centric approach can dominate with relatively few connections between hazards. The question is, and one that's probably much more axiomatic than anything else, is where the greatest source of risk is. But I think we should at least hedge, and so both methods of analysis clearly have their place. As EA dominates the existential risk field, it is our responsibility to promote pluralism through our discourses and our funding. Note, as a final thing, this isn't just the same as openness to criticism, based on a change my mind around a set of rules which a narrow range of funders and community leaders set. Rather, we need pluralism, where ideas around existential risk coexist rather than compete, encouraging exploration and creativity, and in the terms of Adrian Curry, methodological omnivory. There is so little evidentiary feedback loops that a lot of our answers to methodological or quasi-descriptive questions tend to be based more on our prior assumptions, and there often isn't enough evidence to hugely shift these prior assumptions, or evidence that can be explained in multiple ways to reinforce different prior assumptions. This means our values and assumptions hugely impact everything we do. So having a small group of thinkers and funders dominate and dictate the direction of the field is fundamentally dangerous, essentially, no matter how intelligent they are and rational we think they are. So we need to be willing to not just tolerate, but fund and promote work into X-Risk that we may individually think is a dead end, and cede power to others to increase the creativity possible in the field. Because in such uncertainty, promoting creativity and diversity is the correct approach, as hard as it is to accept this. How we square this circle with our ethos of prioritization and effectiveness is a very difficult question, one I do not have the answer to. Maybe it's not possible. But EAs seem to be very, very good at expanding the definition of what is possible in combating the world's biggest problems. This is a question that we must pose, or we risk trillions of future lives. Thank you. One final thing is, I had a reading list here for some of the things I used in the talk, plus some place I drew some of the ideas from. So, and yeah, feel free to stick around to ask questions now. Sorry, this whole thing ran a bit late, but yeah, thank you very much.
There are going to be new sessions almost immediately in this room, so a lot of great questions were sent. I'm sorry, they will have to be reserved for the office hours with Gideon, which no, they have, because the room is warm, sessions are being moved here. So,
sorry.
I'm proposing that anyone who wishes to ask Gideon a question in person can meet over in this corner.
Yeah.
And then you can together go to Gideon's office hours to discuss those questions.
Apologies.
Thank you, everybody.